Hello, this is Dr. Clarence R. Pearson, Sr., and welcome to My View, a podcast where I offer my professional perspective on today's most pressing geopolitical and socioeconomic issues. Recently, my attention has been drawn to developments concerning the growing shift in support for Israel, a shift mostly driven by growing disapproval of Israel's war actions in the Middle East. Here is my view on the matter: the fortress and the forum, Israel's strategic crossroads in an age of conditional support. For decades, Israel's security doctrine rests on more than military power alone. It rests on an ecosystem of diplomatic protection, arms access, intelligence sharing, and political legitimacy across the United States and much of Europe. That ecosystem is now under visible strain. In Washington, the Senate still rejects efforts to block major arms sales to Israel. But April's votes show that most Senate Democrats now support at least one restriction on transfers tied to civilian harm and legal concerns. Abroad, Italy suspends defense cooperation, Spain maintains sweeping transport restrictions on Israel bound weapons, and Britain keeps part of its licensing system under suspension because of humanitarian law concerns. The result is not full abandonment, but something more consequential over time. Support that is no longer automatic and is increasingly conditioned by law, optics, and domestic politics. That shift places Israel at a strategic crossroads. One path is the logic of the fortress: greater self reliance, deeper domestic production, and reduced dependence on suppliers whose politics may change. The other is the logic of the forum: repairing the diplomatic and legal relationships that make military strength more effective because it is embedded in wider alliances. Israel's current leadership is signaling that it prefers not to leave its fate to foreign electorates. In December, Reuters reported that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel would spend about $110 billion over a decade to build an independent arms industry and reduce dependency even on allies. That is not rhetoric alone. Israel's defense ministry has already signed new domestic munitions deals, and the 2026 budget sharply raises defense spending. The logic behind that turn is easy to understand. Israel's leaders are reading the same headlines everyone else is reading. Reuters reported in March that the Trump administration bypassed congressional review to approve additional bomb sales to Israel using emergency authority. In April, Reuters reported that although Sanders led efforts to block about $450 million in bombs and bulldozers failed, they drew support from a large majority of Senate Democrats. For Israeli planners, that is a warning sign. Today's emergency waiver may be tomorrow's failed vote, and tomorrow's failed vote may become the next Congress's new baseline. Yet the fortress model has its own paradox. A country can manufacture shells, drones, and bombs. It cannot manufacture diplomatic depth. Geopolitical deterrence is not just a stockpile. It is the belief in Tehran, Beirut, and beyond that a strike on Israel risks confrontation not only with Israel, but with a network of states that still consider its security closely tied to their own. Once that belief weakens, even a heavily armed country can appear more exposed. The question then is not whether self reliance matters. It plainly does. The question is whether self reliance can substitute for a weakening web of legitimacy and alliance support. Recent events suggest it cannot do so completely. The economic dimension makes the dilemma sharper. Israel's strength is not only its military, it is also its high tech economy, which remains central to growth, exports, and innovation. Reuters reported in late 2025 that Israel's tech sector accounts for about 20% of GDP, 15% of jobs, and more than half of exports. The same report found that 53% of companies reported more relocation requests from employees. Another Reuters report found that nearly half of new Israeli startups were choosing to incorporate abroad. Those trends do not amount to collapse. Reuters also reported in January that Israeli startups raised nearly $16 billion in 2025, and the IMF says the economy has shown resilience. But they do suggest that legal risk, prolonged war, and uncertainty are starting to reshape business decisions in ways that matter for long term strategic power. This is where the Sparta metaphor collides with the demands of a globalized economy. A militarized state can survive under pressure for a time. A high tech economy depends on capital mobility, talent retention, research access, and investor confidence. IMF staff said in February that Israel's economy has accelerated after the Gaza ceasefire, but that downside risks remain substantial, with elevated defense spending, higher risk premia, and labor constraints still weighing on the outlook. Reuters reported in March that Israel's own finance ministry expects growth in 2026, but the same budget process raises the deficit target and embeds still higher defense costs. A state can choose more self sufficiency, but it cannot easily wall off the balance sheet from the reputational and fiscal costs of conflict. The legitimacy gap is widening not only in ministries and markets, but in courts and public opinion. The International Court of Justice did not rule in January 2024 that genocide was proven, but it did order Israel to take steps to prevent acts of genocide and allow more humanitarian assistance in a case brought by South Africa. Later that year, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant for alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity. Israel rejects both lines of legal attack, and many of its supporters argue that the state is being singled out. But whatever one's view of those cases, they are creating a legal and political environment in which allied governments face increasing pressure from courts, parliaments, and civil society to justify continued support. This legal pressure now intersects with a generational shift. Gallup reported in February that for the first time, a majority of Americans aged 18 to 34 say they sympathize more with Palestinians than Israelis, while only 23% of that age group say they sympathize more with Israelis. Among independents, Gallup found that sympathy for Palestinians has also climbed. That does not immediately rewrite US policy, but it does suggest that the electorate from which future senators, presidents, and party coalitions will emerge is not viewing the conflict through the same lens as earlier generations. For a country as dependent on bipartisan American support as Israel has long been, that trend matters. Europe tells a similar story, though in a different register. The current picture is uneven, not uniform. Germany has oscillated, Britain has only partially suspended licenses, and Canada freezes new permits while allowing earlier contracts to proceed. But the direction of travel is unmistakable. Italy has now suspended its defense cooperation agreement with Israel. Spain has banned ships and aircraft carrying weapons to Israel from its ports and airspace. Dutch courts have intervened in F 35 parts transfers. These are not symbolic statements alone, they are legal and logistical signals that military cooperation with Israel is becoming more politically costly inside allied democracies. Israeli leaders are not blind to this. Their answer, however, is largely defiance plus restructuring. The message from Netanyahu's government is that Israel will fight alone if necessary and will build the industrial base to make that feasible. That is a coherent short-term strategy for surviving embargo risk. It is less obviously a long-term strategy for avoiding isolation. A state can compensate for some missing imports with domestic production. It cannot easily compensate for shrinking sympathy among younger Americans, recurring legal cases in international courts, or a slow reputational tax on its export-facing sectors. Those pressures accumulate differently, but they accumulate all the same. The deeper question is what kind of state Israel wants to be over the next generation. The fortress model offers resilience, but at the price of a harsher strategic solitude. The forum model does not eliminate danger, but it seeks to anchor Israel's security in restored legitimacy, broader partnerships, and a regional architecture that includes Arab normalization rather than perpetual diplomatic triage. Analysts across the spectrum continue to point to the importance of Saudi normalization and regional integration as a more durable shield against Iran than military insulation alone. Even many Israeli strategists who support stronger domestic production do not deny that political legitimacy remains a force multiplier. Israel, then, is not yet abandoned, and it is not without options. Its economy remains resilient by many measures. Its defense industry is expanding, and the United States still provides crucial support. But the era of the unquestioned blank check is fading. What replaces it may determine not only how Israel fights, but how it lives. as a highly armed state increasingly alone, or as a state that retains both the capacity to defend itself and the international relationships that make that defense sustainable. The issue is no longer whether Israel can be a fortress. It plainly can. The issue is whether it can remain a fortress without losing the forum that once made the fortress strategically stronger. My View is a continuing series where I share informed commentary on a wide range of geopolitical and socioeconomic topics. If you found today's discussion helpful, please follow, subscribe, like, and share. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I invite you to explore other My View episodes available online. Until we meet again, goodbye